Hey there. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm thrilled you're back for another story. I've got a fresh tale to share, so let's dive right in. I'm Jeff, and what I'm about to tell you is something I never imagined I'd experience in a million years. If you'd asked me 10 months ago whether I had faith in my wife, I'd have nodded without a second thought, no question about it. Agnes, my wife, held my entire heart. She wasn't just my spouse, but my closest confidant, my teammate, the one I pictured growing old with forever. I never once had a reason to question her loyalty or love. When you meet Agnes, you instantly think, wow, she's genuinely kind. She has this warm, calming vibe, always flashing a gentle smile and carrying herself with such elegance. You'd look at her and never suspect she could hurt anyone, especially not the guy who poured his whole soul into loving her. That's why the events that unfolded hit me like a freight train, so hard to wrap my head around. To anyone peeking into our lives, our marriage looked rock solid, picture perfect even. At home, things felt as steady as ever. Agnes hadn't changed a bit. She didn't pull away, didn't treat me any differently, and if anything, she seemed as content as always, keeping our home cozy, checking in on me, and doing those small gestures that made me feel so cared for. My job had me traveling a lot, but even then, everything stayed consistent. She'd call, text, keep me in the loop about her day, just like always. There were no red flags, no sudden mood shifts, no mysterious absences, or late-night outings that'd raise an eyebrow. If you'd asked me to bet on it, I'd have staked everything on her faithfulness, no doubt in my mind. So when she broke the news that she was pregnant, something in my gut twisted, like a warning bell going off. It was late one evening, and I just dragged myself home, exhausted from a brutal day managing my company's growth. I was beat, mentally fried, but there she was in the kitchen, practically beaming with excitement. She spun around, her smile wide, and said, "Jeff, I've got the best news. We're having a baby." I froze for a split second, then forced a grin and wrapped her in a big hug. I congratulated her, said I was over the moon for us, but deep down, a flicker of doubt started creeping in, gnawing at me. I'd been on the road for weeks, barely home long enough to sit down for dinner, let alone share intimate moments with my wife. The math in my head wasn't adding up, and it left me uneasy. But I didn't say a word. What could I say? "That's awesome, Agnes, but how's this possible when I've hardly been around?" Yeah, that'd spark an argument, and if there was even a slim chance the baby was mine, I didn't want to stir up trouble for no reason. So, I shoved my suspicions down, kept my expression calm, and played the part of the thrilled husband. That night, alone in our bedroom, I started piecing things together in my mind. Pregnancy is tracked in weeks, starting from the first day of a woman's last cycle. If Agnes just found out she was pregnant, she'd likely missed at least one period already. But when I thought back to my travel schedule, the last time we'd been together was way outside the window for when conception could have happened. About 10 days later, I casually brought it up one night. "So, babe, how far along do you think you are?" I kept my tone light, non-accusatory. She glanced up from her phone and shrugged. "Not sure. Maybe a month, maybe a bit more," she said, all vague. That response didn't sit right with me at all. Most women, especially when they've just learned they're expecting, have some sense of their timeline. Many track their cycles closely. But she acted like it hadn't even crossed her mind, which felt off. I just nodded, pretending it was no big deal, and said, "When should we book your first doctor's visit? I want to be there for the first ultrasound. See our little one with you." I flashed a smile, playing the excited dad-to-be. She seemed caught off guard for a moment but then smiled back. "That's so sweet of you," she said, clearly not expecting me to be so involved. That was my plan, though. I wanted to be right there, hearing everything firsthand. If she had time alone with the doctor, she might try to fudge the dates to make it all seem plausible. But with me in the room, she'd have less room to maneuver. A few days later, we were at the clinic. I sat next to her, keeping my face relaxed as the technician glided the ultrasound wand over her belly. I stayed composed, watching the screen. Then it lit up, and the technician said, "Looks like you're about 7 weeks along." 7 weeks. I didn't flinch, just nodded and smiled like any proud husband would. But inside, it all snapped into place, confirming the nagging fear I'd been wrestling with. In that time frame, I hadn't been intimate with Agnes, not even close, so there was no chance this baby could be mine. I glanced over at her, and she was beaming at the ultrasound screen, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind. That moment should have been pure joy, a memory to cherish if the child was mine, but instead, a cold numbness washed over me, chilling me to the core. While she sat there, confident her secret was safe, I was already mapping out my next steps for when the truth finally spilled out. To keep myself sane, I buried myself in work, pouring every ounce of energy into my job to stay distracted. For weeks, I grappled with the same nagging question. Could our marriage survive if this baby wasn't mine? I wondered if I could ever move past the betrayal or find a way to forgive her. But the more I mulled it over, the clearer it became that staying would mean either living with a lie or raising a child that wasn't mine. Neither option felt right in my gut. I knew that if a paternity test confirmed my worst suspicions, I had to be prepared to walk away, no hesitation. That's when I reached out to my lawyer, determined to protect myself. I wasn't just ready to end the marriage. I wanted to ensure that leaving wouldn't cost me everything I'd worked so hard to build. There was no way I'd let her betrayal strip me of my livelihood. So we got to work. Together, we carefully reorganized my finances, layer by layer, until it looked like I owned almost nothing on paper. The house was no longer in my name. The cars were tied to a holding company, and my business was legally owned by a foreign entity I'd set up years ago for tax purposes. If Agnes thought she'd walk away with half of my assets, she was in for a big surprise. My lawyer ensured every detail was ironclad, impossible to challenge, so if things went south, she'd leave with only what she brought into our marriage, nothing more. So, I bided my time, kept working, planned carefully, and watched the months roll by, knowing I'd be ready when the truth finally came to light. Time flew, and before I knew it, Agnes was in labor. I was out of town for work when I got the news. Most guys in my shoes would have been buzzing with excitement, racing back to meet their newborn, but for me, it wasn't about joy. I booked the next flight home for one reason. I needed to be there to ensure a DNA test was done before any emotions or legal papers tied me to a child that wasn't mine. By the time I landed and rushed to the hospital, Agnes had already given birth. She was lying in bed, exhausted but smiling brightly when I walked in. The nurses and doctors greeted me warmly, assuming I was just another thrilled dad meeting his son for the first time. I played the role perfectly, walking over, kissing Agnes's forehead, and glancing at the baby in her arms. He was tiny, wrinkled, with that delicate newborn look, but I felt nothing, no connection, no spark. Agnes probably thought my quietness was just me being overwhelmed with emotion. She looked up at me, her eyes misty, and said, "Isn't he just perfect?" I nodded, forcing a small smile, careful not to let my guard down. If I showed any hint of doubt, it might tip her off, and she had no clue what was coming. When the nurse brought over the birth certificate, I took a deep breath and said calmly, "I'll sign it later. I just want to soak all this in first." Nobody batted an eye. New dads get emotional all the time, but I had no intention of signing anything until the DNA results were in. The hospital allowed paternity tests on request, and I'd arranged everything before I even arrived. The sample was taken that same day, and Agnes was too worn out to notice. I kept acting like everything was normal, not letting on that anything was up. Hours later, the results arrived. I sat in the hospital lounge, holding the envelope, already certain of what it would say. I'd spent months bracing for this, but when I opened it and saw probability of paternity, 0%, in stark black and white, it hit like a punch. I took a slow, steady breath, folded the paper carefully, and slipped it into my pocket. When I walked back into Agnes's room, she was gently rocking the baby, completely unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. As we left the hospital parking lot, the air in the car felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Agnes had just given birth, and in a perfect world, this would have been a moment of pure happiness. But I wasn't smiling, wasn't holding her hand, wasn't chatting about baby names. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind sharp and focused. I'd waited 10 long months for this, and now there was no more waiting. I took a different turn, one that didn't lead home. At first, she didn't notice, probably too wrapped up in the moment, thinking we were heading back as a happy little family. But as the roads grew unfamiliar, the reality started to sink in. Agnes turned to me, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Where are we headed?" she asked, her tone soft but wary, like she sensed something was off. I kept my gaze fixed on the road, letting the silence linger for a moment, wanting her to feel the gravity of what was about to unfold. After a beat, I spoke, my voice steady and deliberate. "Who's the real father of that baby?" The car went quiet, just for a heartbeat, before she whipped her head toward me, her face a mix of shock and denial. "Jeff." "What? How could you even think that?" she exclaimed, shaking her head as if my question was absurd, trying to brush it off like I was crazy for doubting her. But I didn't waver, not for a second. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the folded DNA test results, and dropped them onto her lap. "Take a look," I said, my tone flat but firm. Her hand shook slightly as she unfolded the paper, her eyes darting across the words, and I watched as the color drained from her cheeks, her expression crumbling. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her breathing quickened, and for the first time since she announced her pregnancy, she was speechless. I let the silence stretch, giving her time to absorb the reality, to sit with the weight of her deception. Then, like a light switching on, she found her voice. "Jeff, please," she whispered, her tone desperate, "let's go home and talk this through." Her voice cracked, and I could hear the panic creeping in. She wasn't denying it anymore, just scrambling to limit the fallout. I let out a dry chuckle, shaking my head. "Home," I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. I glanced at her, letting my hurt and anger show for the first time. "Agnes, you're going home, but not to our place." Her breath caught, and she turned to face me fully, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible, trembling with dread. I didn't respond, just kept driving. She'd figure it out soon enough. I pulled into the driveway of her parents' house and shifted the car into park. The engine hummed quietly, but the air inside the car was thick with tension. Agnes glanced out the window, her face still pale from the bombshell I dropped, and as she realized where we were, panic flickered across her expression. "Jeff, why are we here?" she asked, her voice shaking, almost begging for an explanation. I gripped the steering wheel, exhaling slowly to keep my composure. "Get out," I said, my tone calm but unyielding, no room for debate. Her breathing hitched, and she pleaded, "No, please, let's go home and sort this out. I'm begging you." I turned to face her, locking eyes with her for the first time. "This is your home now. Get out." The betrayal was done, and I wasn't here to negotiate or hear excuses. The front door of the house creaked open, and her parents stepped outside, looking confused. Her mom frowned, taking a cautious step forward. "Agnes, what's going on?" she called out, her voice filled with concern. Agnes turned to me, her eyes pleading, but I leaned back in my seat and nodded toward her parents. "Go on," I said, my voice steady. "Tell them who the baby's father is." Her face went white, her lips trembling as she realized there was no way out. "Jeff, please," she whispered, but I cut her off, my voice sharper now. "Tell them." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched the baby tightly. Her mother hurried down the steps, wrapping an arm around her. "What's happening?" she asked again, glancing between us, her worry growing. I stayed silent. This wasn't my mess to clean up. Her father, still on the porch, took a slow step forward, his face tense as he started piecing things together, his eyes locking onto mine as if searching for confirmation. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Her mom gently took the baby from Agnes's arms, her instincts kicking in despite her confusion. "Come inside," she whispered softly, trying to comfort her daughter. But Agnes stood frozen, sobbing, unable to move. I didn't wait any longer. The moment the baby was out of her arms and she stepped out of the car, I slid back into the driver's seat, reached for the gear shift, and shut the door. I had no final words, no goodbye. I backed out of the driveway and drove off, leaving them standing there, bewildered and reeling from the consequences of her choices. That night, alone in my house, I sent a message to my lawyer. Go ahead with the divorce. Cite infidelity, attach the DNA proof. I'd spent months preparing for this, and now that the moment was here, I felt empty, but resolute. The next morning, I was up early, arranging for a locksmith to change every lock on the house. I wasn't giving Agnes a chance to step foot in my home again, not after what she'd done. By the time the locksmith arrived, I'd already packed up the last traces of her clothes, her personal items, anything she'd left behind before going into labor. I didn't toss them out or send them to her parents. They weren't my problem anymore. Later that day, Agnes showed up at the front door, trying her key, only to find it didn't work. I watched from inside as she tried again, her confusion turning to frustration as she jiggled the lock. She rang the doorbell, but I didn't move. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and moments later, my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. I blocked her number without a second thought. Minutes later, another unknown number called, and the moment I heard her voice, I blocked that one too. Tired of waiting, she left, but she didn't give up. She kept trying new numbers, texts, voicemails, some angry, some desperate, but none of them mattered to me. I wasn't interested in her excuses. She'd made her choice when she betrayed me and tried to pass off another man's child as mine. She had no place in my life anymore. Soon, her parents started calling too. First, her mom, with that gentle, pleading tone, saying we should talk things out like adults. Then her dad, more stern, urging me to at least be reasonable. Reasonable? Was it reasonable for their daughter to deceive her husband and expect him to just accept it? I blocked them both without hesitation. The family I'd once built with Agnes was gone, and I was determined to make that crystal clear. When the divorce papers were delivered to Agnes at her parents' house, I didn't expect the fight she put up. She hired a lawyer, contested the divorce, and tried to spin a story where I was the villain, the husband who abandoned her in her time of need, the man who turned his back on his child. She clung to that lie, as if repeating it would somehow make it true. But I had the truth on my side, backed by hard evidence. The court ordered another DNA test, and just like before, the results were undeniable. The child wasn't mine. When those results were presented in court, the atmosphere shifted. I saw it in the judge's expression, in the way Agnes's lawyer's confidence faltered. There was no room left for her to argue. The facts were laid bare in black and white. She'd cheated, gotten pregnant, and tried to deceive me into raising another man's child. No amount of tears or desperate pleas could change that. When the judge finally ruled, it was exactly what I'd expected. The divorce was granted. Normally, I might have had to split assets, pay spousal support, or cover her legal fees, but thanks to the groundwork I'd laid with my lawyer, there was nothing to divide. Legally, I owned almost nothing. My business, properties, and accounts were all shielded by airtight structures. Agnes walked into that courtroom thinking she'd walk away with something. She left with nothing. As I stepped out into the courthouse parking lot, I saw her standing with her parents. She was crying, her mom holding her close, whispering something, while her dad stood silently, staring at the ground. They looked shattered, all of them. I never imagined I'd end up in a situation like this. I never thought the woman I loved, the woman I trusted with my whole heart, would betray me so deeply. And I certainly never thought I'd be able to walk away without a shred of sympathy for her. But betrayal changes you. It hardens you in ways you don't see coming. I gave Agnes my love, my trust, my loyalty. She gave me lies, deception, and a child that wasn't mine. Now, she was just a part of my past. As I walked to my car and drove off, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't looking back. Reflecting on everything, I've learned some tough but valuable lessons from this ordeal, and I want to share them with you because no one expects to face something like this until it happens. First, blind trust is a risky move. No matter how kind someone seems or how much you love them, don't assume they're incapable of letting you down. I trusted Agnes completely, never questioning what she was up to when I was away, and that's how I got blindsided. She didn't act any different, didn't treat me poorly. If I judged her solely on her behavior, I'd have never suspected a thing. But the truth doesn't care about your feelings. People can do things you'd never imagine, so stay alert, trust, but always verify. Second, financial security is everything. When emotions run high, you can't afford to be careless. If I hadn't protected my assets before confronting her, I could have lost everything in the divorce. The law doesn't care about your heartbreak, it cares about what's legally yours. In many cases, even if your spouse betrays you, you might still have to pay them if you're not prepared. That's why I made sure I legally owned nothing. My house, cars, business, all of it was untouchable. When the time came, she walked away empty-handed, and I didn't have to fight to keep what was mine. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Always structure your finances to shield you from the worst-case scenario, because you never know when you'll need that protection. Third, staying in control of your emotions is a game-changer. If I'd lashed out the moment I suspected her, I would have lost my advantage. If I'd confronted her too early, she could have lied, manipulated, or played the victim. If I'd acted on impulse, I might have made choices that hurt me later. Instead, I stayed calm, planned carefully, and waited for the truth to come out. By the time I acted, I had all the proof I needed. People might try to make you doubt yourself when they're caught, but with patience and emotional discipline, you hold the upper hand. Finally, some betrayals are beyond forgiveness. I don't look at love the same way anymore. I used to think love was enough to hold two people together. Now I know it's about actions, especially what someone does when they think they won't get caught. Agnes didn't just betray me. She got pregnant, carried another man's child, and tried to pass it off as mine. That's not just a mistake, that's a calculated deception. When someone shows you who they really are, don't make excuses for them. Walk away. That's my story, folks, but now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my shoes? Could you have forgiven her? Would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story gripping, give it a like, share it with others, and hit that subscribe button. I've got more stories lined up for you, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.